I appreciate this invitation, and the subject of climate change and health is very concerning. We have neglected the field of climate change and health. For many reasons, there was no data a couple of decades ago, so we focused the issue of climate in a different direction. However, at the end of the day, it's children, and at the end of the day, it's humans, because they are the ones that inheriting the earth that we have here, and they are the ones that are going to be affected and are the future leaders for this problem. So what I'm going to do today is to talk about climate change in the context of human health, and also I am going to talk about hope very briefly, because climate change at the end of the day, again, is an issue of vulnerability, it's an issue of social justice, and it's an issue of hope. Couple of comments. I am an academician. I volunteer for the Climate Reality Project, but I don't have any financial interest. Now, when we talk about greenhouse gases, and what I'll do is I'll give a brief introduction of what climate is, the climate science, and also I will go through many pictures about health, and I will not give so many data, but I will try to share and promote the health process. So we know that greenhouse gases come not only from burning fossil fuels, but from many other sources. So as the carbon emissions, CO2, which is the most important greenhouse gas, increase, they've been increasing since 1850, after the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and you can see the changes that we observe. The issue is that as climate or temperature increases, as CO2 increases, the temperature increases. So there's almost a direct correlation between one or the other. And this is what's happening since 1880. So, extreme weather events, and this is an issue of weather, you can see that worldwide they have increased over the last years. Now, let's talk about vulnerability again, because climate change is about vulnerability. And most of us will not experience that. We have this beautiful place, we have AC, and we have resources to cope. The problem is those that are vulnerable, and they don't have the resources that we have. Now, this is vital because the countries that emit the most CO2 are the countries that will be least affected by climate change, except for India, which you can see there. And again, vulnerability, we will not see it. And the reason is that the reality that we know is completely different. I know that most of us are not aware of number one, or at least we don't experience number one, but this is what we see on a daily basis. And so why are we making a lot of progress, or why are we making more progress? As the scientific community has come to realize that climate change is a big problem, we have more publications from respectable institutions saying that we need to pay attention to this. What I'll do today is just discuss briefly the direct effects, and you'll see number one there, where we have the direct effects of climate change, and now the indirect effects of how climate affects the ecosystems, and then the effects on human health. So heat stress, vulnerability again. Children and less than 1 year of age and adults over 65 are the most vulnerable in heat waves. However, we know that the poor, outdoor workers, and homeless, among other groups, are very vulnerable and exposed to these problems. 2003, there was a heat wave in Europe. There were over 70,000 excess deaths compared to the average. Now, does it happen only in Europe? 1995, there were 739 deaths in the Chicago heat wave. I cannot say that it's climate, but I can say that it can happen here. And if we come to Texas, in 2011, we have a very severe heat wave. There were 3.6% increased visits to the emergency rooms in Harris County, some of them because heat waves. Now, unfortunately, hunger and malnutrition are going to increase. By 2050, we expect 20% increase in malnutrition because of the changes that we see in climate change. Will we experience this here? Chances are that we're not. And that comes to the issue of social justice and vulnerability. So the yield of corn and wheat, well, I'm so sorry, I apologize for that. But you know, what is happening with heat? And we never imagine that the corn yields will decrease with heat exposure. And the same happens with wheat. Now, a lot of our economy and the nutrition, the subsistence of other countries depends on this. And again, there's a dramatic decrease in the yield of other grains. And the other thing is that CO2, not temperature, but CO2 affects the nutritional value provided by the C3 grains. So again, if we think about this, yes, we're going to be affected here in the US, I say in the US, in Puerto Rico, but it will not have the same consequences. Now, I will talk very briefly about allergies because I am an allergist and I do that every day, so I don't want to hear about allergies. No, that's a joke. But anyway, we know that CO2 concentrations, increased levels of CO2, will increase not only the number of grains of pollen, and you can see what is happening in 2000 and what we expect in 2040, and very interesting because the allergenicity of these pollens, meaning the capacity that these pollens have to induce allergy symptoms, is also increased by climate change and CO2 levels. Infectious diseases, we heard about that. We heard about Lyme disease. We heard about West Nile virus. We'll heard about many other conditions. And if we think about this, you disrupt the ecosystem of these vectors. Let's talk about vectors now. And that creates an imbalance that makes us more susceptible to these problems. Now, there's a couple of conditions like chikungunya and Zika where we don't know if this is related to climate. The jury's still out. I think that is too early, but there's a group number of conditions that we know that this is the case. And there's no denying. The issue is that there's something happening. And we are seeing in our country and other places diseases that we didn't used to see before. Cholera, malaria, and Lyme disease, there's no question that those are related or have been changing because of various changes in the context of climate change. Diarrheal diseases are expected to increase. Now, the incidence of diarrhea, and in this case, diarrheal infections in Peru, we know that increases, and there's a significant correlation with temperature changes. So the temperature increases, diarrhea increases, temperature goes down, the diarrhea goes down. So we need to think about this because as we have fluctuations in temperature and the changes in climate change, that's going to affect how some populations are affected. The rains will become, the heavy rains will become heavier, dry areas will become drier. And we've seen some of this in our country. We know that in the southwest US and the northeast, we have seen increased rains. I don't know if it's weather or it's climate, but you have seen that when it rains in Texas, it rains more. And then we had a dramatic heat wave in 2011. And I'm not saying that that's climate change. It could be changes with the weather, but maybe as we develop and we follow those trends, we'll see the difference. Water scarcity, 40% of the world population is affected by water scarcity, and that creates not only social problems with agricultural, emotional stress, but also political problems. And all of us are going to be affected, and you can see that in that map, including the US. But again, we need to think about vulnerability and the ability to cope. This is just an example of how the water problems are going to be affecting what happens in our country. Now, global air pollution, we hear about global air pollution, and we know that increasing air pollution affects the mortality in the world. There's a recent report where we know that 6.5 million, think about that, 6.5 million of individuals will suffer yearly more premature deaths because of air pollution. Who will be affected? Individuals with asthma, 300 million in the world, 25 million in the US. Individuals with chronic lung disease, individuals with heart disease, and other susceptible populations that, again, don't have the means to protect themselves against climate change. IPCC, unfortunately, this problem is not going to get better. Although we have improved the air quality in our country during with the institution of the Clean Air Act and other measures, we're still having problems, and again, in some other places. Now, think about this. This is a study done in 2010, and it's on children with asthma and what happened with them when they got exposed in days of high ozone levels. And children were the most affected, particularly those in the age of 6 to 18 groups, 18 years old, who were admitted to the intensive care unit. This is sobering data. Because children that have grown, think about this, most of us have been exposed to the changes of climate change and air pollution just for short periods of time. So what happens to children that have grown all their life exposed to air pollution? The most sobering data that I find, and it's not asthma or chronic lung disease, is what happens in utero, because some of these changes start in utero, but children that have grown in areas with dramatic air pollution, they have changes in their brain. There is increased inflammation. There are changes that are considered pre-Alzheimer's and pre-Parkinson's. They have changes in behavior. They have problems with cognition. The structure of the brain has changed. Again, heart disease. Air pollution promotes the increased numbers of heart disease and stroke. Now, mental illness, the problem of mental illness was neglected. And it's been neglected since the very beginning of the conversation about climate change. It was not in the original IPCC's reports. It was not in the synthesis assessment reports. Or if anything was mentioned briefly in those reports. But we know now, and it's expected, that mental health is affected. And actually, we don't know. I cannot say that we know. I can say that now we are aware and paying some attention. So imagine that you were exposed to this. Imagine that you were exposed to this, and this is the reality of many individuals in the world and also here. Imagine that you're exposed to this. Katrina, the population displacement in Katrina was overwhelming, and this is what we saw in terms of what happened to the population and where did they go. You know, and this was unreal. I was volunteering one of the, during Katrina, I don't remember if it was the Astrodome, but it was one of them. And I would hear, there were all of these people sleeping there or walking around, and I would hear, we have 4 airplane tickets donated by United to Canada. A family of 4, a group of 4 that wants to go to Canada, or we have 2 tickets that we can donate to go to New York. Somebody wants to go to New York. Then in my children's schools, we got a good number of kids from Louisiana, and many of them had emotional problems and problems with learning. So what do we do? What do we do? Can we make a difference in these problems? Now, Reason for Hope, December of 2015, the world signed the Paris Agreement, and this was overwhelmingly emotional because actually 195 countries came together in Paris, and they signed the Paris Agreement. You know, and it was great to see the Christians with the Muslims with the non-believers, enemies, countries that were enemies, all of them with a common interest. The Paris Agreement was signed, and the goal is to decrease the temperature of the world by 2 degrees compared to pre-industrial levels, hopefully 1.5 degrees, because that is the tipping point, or is expected to be the tipping point in terms of damage to the Earth. So what do we do? Do we have reason for hope? Yes, you see the Paris Agreement. Do we have reason for hope here? You bet, because we've come as a group of individuals. Many of us didn't know each other, and now we are going to establish networks, and we're going to share our knowledge and resources. And in the political uncertainty of our country these days, and the concern or the neglect, the potential neglect about climate change, we cannot give up hope. Thank you so much.